Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko Selberg, and I co-host the lounge with Barbara Frontera and Tiani Jones. Today, we welcome Jean Boulton to the Complexity Lounge. Jean is a visiting fellow at the University of Bath, Department of Social and Policy Sciences, with the Cranfield School of Management. She studied physics at the University of Oxford and Cambridge and is a fellow at the Institute of Physics. She is also the lead author of Embracing Complexity, and her new book, The Dao of Complexity, expands on process complexity and explores the resonances with other schools of thought, such as Daoism. Today, Jean will discuss process complexity, building on the works of Ilya Prigogine, and show how it proffers an underpinning perspective from which to understand resilience, chaos, lock-in, and collapse. We will also explore how process complexity relates to the work of other foundational thinkers, including Kauffman, Stacey, Goodwin, Cilliers, and others. So, Jean, welcome to the lounge.
Thanks very much. Nice to be here. What I wanted to try and cover, and I'm not going to use slides, is partly I'm going to start by exploring this question that I think we should always ask people when they're talking about these ideas, which is, where are they coming from? What is the ground that they stand on? How do we understand what they're saying through understanding where they're coming from, that sort of lens? And also this kind of idea of what is the driving question they have? What are they carrying around? I think that the whole field of complexity is quite difficult to navigate, because many people are coming from very different directions, and there's often a sense of talking across people, because even what the words mean, like what does complexity mean, is kind of held differently by different people. So I wanted to just start there with trying to explain, in a sense, where I'm coming from and what's driving me in this field. It's a field I've been involved in since the late 1990s, and worked with Peter Allen at Cranfield, who worked with Ilya Prigogine. And that's been a very kind of foundational and important kind of theme for me. But the ground I stand on is there are some different aspects to it, and I just thought it would be useful to try and explain that. So as Jocko said, I started off in physics, and my PhD was in quantum physics. And looking back on it, that was quite foundational for me, because quantum physics really does do your head in. It won't sit neatly. As I think Richard Feynman said, and anybody who thinks they understand complexity, quantum theory is not telling the truth. It's very difficult kind of to get your head round, and in a good way, it creates a kind of critical thinking mentality, because you're constantly, in a sense, saying, so what is real here? Is anything real? What does this mean? And it struck me. I was rereading something I'd written in Embracing Complexity this afternoon. And I was referring to someone called Mitrov, who did some work on moon scientists. And he was saying there's kind of two sorts of scientists. There are the people who are very meticulous, who drill down, who have a kind of really meticulous, mechanical, detailed approach to their science. And there are other scientists who are much more kind of integrative, who are kind of trying to always ask the critical questions, connect things up, go beyond. And I'm not saying I'm good at that, but that is in the kind of scientist I am, I think, and that was kind of made into the foundation for me for that was studying quantum physics. So that's one big theme that you have to understand me through. The next phase of my life, through moving, I won't go through the whole thing, but I moved through various steps into working in organisations on strategy and organisation change. So I became ultimately head of one of the large management consultancies practice in strategy and organisation change. So I'd worked in management. I'd done an MBA. I'd done all the things that they tell you to do on MBAs, and recognize what didn't work and what did work, and what were the limits of that. So I took these ideas into strategy work and into kind of structural organisation change, into large scale change. So that, and I want to come back to that at the end. That shaped how I think about the kind of work that I do. I then had a little foray as an interest really into training as a Gestalt therapist. So it started to kind of bring in this theory of the inner, of the individual into my work, as well as these big picture kind of, what is the market like? What is the environment like? How does an organization develop its strategy? This Gestalt took me into this inner. And at that time, which is about the mid 1990s, I'd come across complexity theory and really was entranced by it, and in a sense have remained entranced by it ever since. It seemed to make a lot of sense to me in terms of the way the world works, the way things change, and understanding that I could really grasp onto and was keen to understand more. And somewhat by coincidence, I discovered that Peter Allen, a real foundational thinker in this field, who'd worked with Ilya Prigogine, was actually situated in the business school in Cranfield, where I'd done my MBA. So it was kind of perfect for me. And I joined the staff there part-time for a few years and deeply worked with Peter Allen. And then did various other things. And the fourth kind of strand I want to bring in that really influences the way I approach things and think about things is working with Professor Peter Reason at the University of Bath. I started to teach complexity on some of his programs and the group that worked around him, which was really looking at action research, but in a very deep and philosophical way, not just like we do research and it has an impact and there's no separation between research and action. But Peter, who I'm still close to and see quite often, really introduced me, I think, in a much more grounded way to the tenets of social science. And what he was describing in action research is what the pragmatists, what John Dewey called a naturalistic approach to metaphysics. The idea that you learn about the way the world works through being in it, through an empirical kind of experiential approach to knowing, not in the ways that Plato did and science is often thought to do, in a kind of much more theoretical way, where you kind of have an idea and then go and test it. So that was also very foundational for me. And I did another research degree with Peter, looking at the interplay between complexity and action research, and this kind of much more grounded, pragmatist, naturalistic approach to understanding things. So I have become the integration of those different themes, and it influences the way that I approach complexity theory, which has remained the kind of central feature of my work. But that's what I wanted to say, and I think I'm sharing this with you, but I really recommend, when you're listening to other speakers or reading things, to try and understand that background, because it really does affect what people regard as normal or obvious or important, and what they take for granted in terms of their assumptions. The second bit I wanted to just say a bit about is so what drives me then? What is the question I'm answering all the time? What do I carry around with me? And for me, the question I'm asking is a scientific, a meta-scientific, a metaphysical question of, so what is the nature of reality? Is there a reality? Is there something that's common across different contexts? Can we understand the changes in the brain in the same way as the changes in a galaxy? Is that a stupid thing to ask? Is there something common? Is there something I can start to understand about the nature of the complex world, the nature of the open, connecting world that we live in? That would really help me to decide then how to live and work. So I'm not driving for methods, which isn't to say I don't end up with methods. I'm driving for this question all the time of, how does the world show up? Is this idea I have about emergence, is that showing up in the world? Does it still stand up to scrutiny when I actually carry that around into the situations I find myself in? So why do things change? What is the nature of reality? Is there a reality? What does that mean? Is it common across contexts and disciplines or not? What does that mean for practice is my sort of secondary question. So you will see me approaching this in that kind of sort of scientific or metaphysical way. So I wanted to say that by way of introduction. So what I wanted to try and cover three questions in this session. The first one is to answer the question which the second book, The Dao of Complexity, really drills into, which is, what is this thing called process complexity? The second thing I wanted to talk about was, how does that fit? What are other approaches to complexity, and how does this fit? How do I make sense of the other work that's going on in the field of complexity, which of course won't be complete, but is my kind of putting into that. And then the third thing is really, the third thing has got two parts to it. So I want to share a little bit of, so what do I do then? What is my practice of working with these ideas, in anger in an organization, or how do they show up in the way that I live my life? So I wanted to do a sort of so what part of this talk. And I also wanted to share with you some thinking I've been doing about why do we all talk in different ways about this kind of field of complexity or systems thinking, or whatever we call it. Why do some people focus very much on models or maps, and other people are talking in a much more looser relational way? Why is that? How can we understand how both our nature and our predispositions play into that, and also how the structures that we live in and what's rewarded and allowed plays into that kind of approach too. So that's something that's a kind of something I'm working on, bit of work in progress in terms of how to express that. So that's by way of introduction. I hope that sounds okay. And I'm going to launch in. I suspect I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, maybe a bit more. And I can, of course, stop at some point. But does that sound okay? Anybody want to say yes or no, that sounds awful, or any reaction? Does that sound okay? Thanks, Barbara. Thumb up, and one from Diane there. Thank you. So process complexity. What am I saying when I talk about process complexity? So Ilya Prigogine, who's one of the very foundational thinkers in this field. He got the Nobel Prize for his work in 1977, but he was working on this from the 1920s, 1930s. His first paper was written in the 1940s. And he talks about the fact that he was intrigued by reading Henri Bergson's book, Creative Evolution, which asks the question, why does life mount the incline that matter descends? And what he meant by that was, physics has basically two classical theories. One of them is the machine view, which is that things continue along in the same way forever, or the view of equilibrium and thermodynamics, which is that things ultimately decay into featureless dust. Whereas what Bergson was pointing out, and obviously building on Darwin, is that life seems to be able to evolve into often more sophisticated, not always, but often more sophisticated and complex forms. So why is life going in that direction? And physics doesn't seem to have anything to say about that. So the word for which he got the Nobel Prize, I'm sure he wouldn't put it quite as simply as this, but was the word open. That for situations that are open to their wider contexts, they are able to, in a sense, locally transgress the second law of thermodynamics, and order can emerge in a local situation. So that was his starting point, and he was triggered by the work of in particular of Belousov and Sabotinsky in Russia. Prigogine was Russian, although he was working in Brussels by this time. But he obviously could read these papers in Russian. And Belousov and Sabotinsky had discovered this weird thing going on in this chemical system where patterns were emerging on the surface of this particular experiment. And people just thought it was impossible, and it was a kind of error of experimentation, and didn't really take it seriously. And it was really Prigogine who realized the importance of this, and could understand the importance of this idea of order emerging out of chaos, which was the name of one of his initial books. So that was the starting point. And Peter Allen was a postdoc with Prigogine, and eventually moved back to the UK, eventually came to Cranfield and worked initially on ecological systems, but then moved into looking at social systems as well. And the connection with process complexity is that one of the books that Prigogine wrote, and one of his kind of foundational thoughts, was that everything is always becoming. So he wrote a book From Being to Becoming. The point being that things are always adjusting, flowing. They may stay the same, but they're staying the same through micro adjustments and reflexive kind of moving. So self-regulation is a form of stability, but it's a form of stability that comes from a movement. There's something always moving. So Prigogine's work, as was Allen's, was always started with the micro. It wasn't making reifications of things like feedback loops, or even ideas like nonlinearity. It was always starting. Their theorizing started at the level down. It was like, how can we understand how the patterns emerge through understanding this micro interactions? So that's really important. So it's processual, and Eric Jansch, who wrote books about Prigogine, says, Prigogine was a process thinker. So this is a processual approach. It's starting with the micro, and it's looking to understand how things, in a sense, are always becoming. That things may look stable, but they're only stable in the sense that they're held in place by the repeating of reflexive relationships. So that's where I'm coming from in calling this process complexity. And it's nothing that Prigogine didn't use that phrase, but it's nothing that he would have, I think, disagreed with. So what are the conditions for looking at complexity? Is something that I write about in some detail in the Dao of Complexity. The first thing is to understand that for a situation to be complex, it has three characteristics. It needs three qualities. The first one, that it is open to its wider context. So things can go in and out. Energy, information, and matter can go in and out. It's energized through its interaction with that wider context. If things are closed systems, they may show complex behavior for a while, but they'll run out. They won't be able to sustain that patterning unless there's this kind of interaction with the wider world. So there's something about open. There's something about diversity. And there's something about relationships. So this is about things, diverse things that are interacting in reflexive ways, in ways where A affects B and B affects A again, or A affects B in the context of C, and C affects A, and then B is, so it has this idea not of a causal, like A leads to B leads to C, but something where there's this kind of interweaving and interrelating going on. So that's the center of a situation being complex. And there's the behaviour that we're looking at in terms of those complex situations can be summarised, I think, in the idea of patterning. And I use the word patterning much more than I use the word systems, because it has much more of a tentative feel to it. It's like patterns emerge. If they get really, really rigid and fixed, we might start to call them systems. But what we've got to remember is they're only, in a sense, held together through their constitutive relationships. So they're not. We don't want to reify them. It was a point that Ralph Stacey made very strongly, that there's a danger in naming things systems, because it feels like we are the ones that decide on the boundaries, whereas in a sense, what we should be doing in our research is kind of saying, well, what is the patterning here, and what are its natural boundaries? So if, for example, I'm observing a family, or I'm observing a pond, it's not up to me to define where the boundaries are. It's up to me to kind of sense into that, observe it, and say, well, actually, I might have thought that the edge of this wood was the end where the trees go, but actually one of the really important characteristics of how this wood works is that these I'm making this up, but these foxes that are really seminal to bringing in their poo into this wood, because they bring in the very seeds that create the undergrowth to this wood, actually are drinking in this river just a little bit away. So probably I should imagine that the river is an integral part of the way that this complex situation is actually able to emerge. So that's what I mean by talking about patterning. So we're interested in how patterns emerge, how patterns stabilise, how patterns dissolve. So a few more things, there's more I could say about this, but a few more things to say about this kind of view is it's allowing for emergence. And one of the difficulties for closed systems is that things can't emerge, that it's something that Peter Allen and people like Stuart Kauffman make a very strong emphasis on, that new things emerging comes from either some new behaviour within the system, or through something that Peter Allen called invading the system. So it is that this is where you get into this pre-acceptation sort of argument that Kauffman gets into as well. That's one aspect of it. But emergence for me is more than a systemic quality. Sometimes people say this is an emergent quality, meaning it's a systemic quality. So wetness is a systemic quality. It's something that you don't see in hydrogen and oxygen molecules. But the kind of radical emergence that Kauffman talks about, and Peter Allen and Prigogine were talking about, is something that is rearranging the state space, is introducing new dimensions into the situation, and we're likely to see something we've never seen before. It's the emergence of the unknown unknowns, if you like. So that's something that's kind of intrinsic to this view as well. So that's kind of my kind of introduction to process complexity, and I have a series of kind of aspects to it that I explore in the book. There's something paradoxical, there's something about patterning, there's something about the importance of context, and there's also this paradox between the idea that there are patterns. It's not that I need to know everything about a complex situation to get a handle on what's going on. I need to interrogate the patterns that are there. But I've also got to keep an eye on this kind of idea of the processual view, is that there will always, I have to watch out for signs of newness, what the Taoists call sometimes the beginning of the beginning. What are the emerging new shoots of change? What are the cracks that are beginning to appear? So I can't just understand things by analysing now. It creates this sort of dynamic view where I'm looking for what's becoming, what's newly emerging in tiny qualitative ways. How do I both look at analyse what's there, but also notice what's new and what's emerging. So that's the kind of ideas that are there. And the way I'm describing this process complexity is sitting in what Edgar Morin calls general complexity. So I'm not restricting this in any way. I'm dealing with the whole complexity. This is beyond or before mathematics. There's something that often the devil is in the detail. That when we start to abstract, then we may miss the very things that are actually pertinent to change. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So one final thing on process complexity, and then. So I've just noticed said 28 minutes till the first mention of fox poop. Oh, right, good. I've just noticed this comment. Thank you, David. The final thing I wanted to say in this part is that this idea of a processual, relational, diverse view of complexity is both able to understand, and this is where the scientist in me comes in, it's both able to give an explanation for why do things emerge, why do they sometimes self-regulate and become relatively stable, why do they sometimes run away in change, why do they sometimes become locked in and unassailable and rigid and actually push out and limit the diversity and the ability of other things to come into the system. So this is a kind of micro view that can make sense of these different aspects. It's not just assuming stability or assuming we're defining an organization. It's also looking at how does power constellate in political systems. How do certain families become very rigid and locked into behaviors, whereas others are much more resilient and adaptive. Same for organizations. Why do some go in certain directions? So I like it because it has this integrative feeling. I also like it because, and this is the subject of the Dao of Complexity, I notice, without wishing to kind of assert this, that when I look at literature on the way the brain works, when I look at the way galaxies form, when I look at the way some political writers talk about the way power constellates, I find a common understanding, a common approach to understanding patterning, emergence, lock-in. So that is exciting for me, and that's sort of what I've called ontological resonance. I think is very interesting. The fact that something shows up, it makes me feel that we're onto something here that's really generative and useful in understanding the way things are, the way things change, the way things work. So that's my kind of description of process complexity. So I think I won't ask for questions just yet, because I think I'd like to. I think I might do the second bit, which is about other forms of complexity thinking and then ask questions before I then talk a bit more about how I use these ideas in practice. So other approaches to complexity then. So the people that I've been entranced by and attracted to in this field of work tend to be the scientists, I guess. So the people that I go back to and read and reread and watch videos of are people like Ralph Stacey and Paul Cilliers. They were both around at the time that I was working with Peter Allen, and used to come and visit us, as did, although slightly less so, but David Byrne. These are some of the people who really have grappled in a very deep way with what these ideas really mean. And what I found interesting, both for Stacey and Cilliers, is that over time they move from a more technocratic or more kind of a simplifying view of the complex world into, for example, Ralph Stacey talking about complex responsive processes. So although Prigogine and Allen we're not looking specifically at the way humans interact and interweave, Ralph got very interested in the way that those complex responsive processes build up culture. They're embedded in conversation, and that often the shifts that are made in culture or in teamwork come in the tiny moments in those conversations, in those kind of interwoven relationships. So it places this attention on the micro in the same way that, or in a different way, but in similar vein to Prigogine and Allen. So that's very interesting. And some of the people who followed Ralph Stacey in that way have really paid attention, as do Gestalt therapists, to the tiny movements in the space, between people, in a team, in an individual, that the movement sometimes comes from this kind of tiny. So Stacey and Cilliers, in a different way, got interested as well in this kind of the way that the big is interwoven from the small. Which isn't to say that when we create, let's say, culture that's emerged out of these interactions, that in some sense culture doesn't shape the conversations, doesn't act down on us. So we're both constrained by the cultures that we work in, at the same time as we're shaping them. So there's a kind of idea that Daoists talk about, in particular, about the path is made through walking. Which is saying that we are co-creating the future through the movements that we make, but it's also understanding that the path that we are joining a path that's already been in the making. So we're not starting with a clean sheet. We are inhabiting the world that's already emerged so far, and is shaping what we do next and how we can influence it. So Stacey, Cilliers, Brian Goodwin, somebody I worked with too, a biologist. Stuart and Goodwin were biologists, and Matrana and Varela were talking about autopoiesis. And biologists tend to be interested in self-regulation. They're asking, why does the organism become an organism and stabilize? So they have a particular interest in stability. And which is great, and I think I love their work. I gain a lot from their work, and you'll notice that physicists are less bothered about whether things stabilize. They're just as interested in, why is this not stabilizing? Why is it unraveling? Why is it shifting they're interested in path dependency in a different way. So they're not different, but you sometimes have to, when you read them, you can start to feel that complexity is about stability, or complexity is about self-regulation. Whereas it is about that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the situation you're looking at will necessarily self-regulate. So that's something. Stuart Kauffman, I recommend you, for example, looking at Stuart's work. There's a lovely video clip. I'll send a link to this, about emergence, and it's beautiful. He really describes very well this kind of subtlety of how something new happens, which then shifts the state space, shifts the realm of possibilities, which allows something new to emerge. He calls it radical emergence. So those are definitely people that have influenced me. in the first book that I wrote with Peter Allen and Cliff Bowman, Embracing Complexity, we had a whole chapter on modelling, and on the chapter's called The Complexity of Complexity. And I wanted to mention this field because for many people, this is what complexity is. And I'm talking about it in a very different, much more kind of granular way. And Peter Allen led this work. I did a lot of interpretation of this, but this was very much building on Peter Allen's analysis of this field of modelling. And the important thing about reading information that comes from models is to recognise, to try and get to grips with the limiting conditions that are assumed in different sorts of models. So sometimes it's I sometimes search books to see if people are explicit about the simplifying assumptions that they're making, and they don't always clarify those simplifying assumptions. But for example, there's the most simple approach to something that started the field of complexity for many people are the equations of deterministic chaos. And these were very simple equations that were solved computationally in a recursive way. And I remember in the 1980s working for an engineering consultancy, and all the kind of, the pre-AI, computer geeks spent their whole time plotting fractals on their screens very, very slowly because the computing power was so limited. And it was terribly exciting. You had this deterministic equation that was entirely defined by its initial conditions that could move into seemingly chaotic behaviour, although in state space, in another interpretation of that, it was entirely deterministic and contained. So that's great. It's interesting work. Where it becomes problematic is when people then start to say, well, that's what complexity is about, and it's about fractals. So fractals are a quality of deterministic chaos, as is self-similarity, but they're not a representative of the complex world in general. They're an artifact of a certain kind of very simple equation. And we do find examples of fractals I forgot what it's called now. There's a particular sort of cauliflower that seems to have fractal florets. Somebody will know what it's called. And you can talk about fractals, in terms of the coastline. And self-similarity means that the same conditions happens all the way down. But that's not the case in general in the complex social world. It's like I remember reading a paper of a very good friend of mine wrote about fractal leadership. Romanesco, thank you. It was Romanesco cauliflowers. Suggesting that leadership is the same all the way down. Well, it isn't, is it? If I'm experiential, the qualities I need to manage a team of people on the shop floor is not the same as the qualities I need where I'm trying to, build connections, and understand the complex world. When I'm a leader of a major global organisation, they're not the same. So beware of taking things from particular models and then saying, well, that's what complexity says. The other issue about modelling, so I've looked at deterministic chaos, but many models disagree with each other. So von Bertalanffy, for example, who was a contemporary of Prigogine and wrote the book General Systems Theory, talks about equifinality. In other words, in many cases, it doesn't matter where you start, you end up in the same place. This would be the idea. Well, I won't say that. I was about to explain that. But, there's something called equifinality. Some situations, wherever you start, you kind of end up, in the same attractor basin. You don't move very far. That's very different from sensitivity to initial conditions. Some situations are very sensitive to initial conditions, some aren't. So it's just really some to be aware of, and this is quite unpicked in this chapter. Peter Allen worked a lot with the master equation, which is a very complex piece of mathematics that tries to work with all possible states rather than the most probable states. So it takes a much broader view of probability. Some models assume stationarity. They say, let's assume things reach equilibrium and stationarity. They reach a balance. Other models allow you to explore whether you come to stationarity. So it's a very complex world. And when I notice sometimes people have lists of attributes of complex systems that have been taken from different lists, different sorts of models, which sometimes have fractal, sometimes have nonlinearity. It's just be aware of that. It's a sort of reification of certain terms that people kind of carry around these terms in their kind of suitcase. But I would recommend that you go much further back into the kind of granular fundamentals of what are the common features that are much more robust in terms of understanding how the complex world operates. So that's I can say a lot more about that, but that's what I just wanted to say. Just to say another one that's been incredibly popular is the edge of chaos. The edge of chaos came out of a very simple model by Chris Langton in the 1980s, which showed a phase change in a particular sort of model, and people have waxed lyrical about the edge of chaos ever since. If you do more sophisticated modelling, you find that sometimes situations smoothly shift into something new. They can tip, if you want to use that word, into a new regime quite seamlessly. Sometimes they might move into chaos, sometimes they might not. Too much chaos isn't going to help. Not enough diversity isn't going to help. But the idea that there's something special about the edge of chaos is to be questioned and is an artifact of a certain sort of model. So that's my modelling speech and why, although I come from a modelling background, my PhD was in modelling and Peter did a lot of modelling. He was constantly aware of the limitations of models and the way that often policymakers wanted certainty from a model, and didn't understand that the model is a kind of conversation, only as good as the information you put into it, and that you must always be aware of the limiting assumptions that it's based on. Just one more example of that I write about, I think, in both books. Peter did some work on I can't remember the name of the bay now. Anyway, it was looking at a fisheries model. It was an area where there was an awful lot of data about the fish, Chesapeake Bay. That was it. The fish, what sizes fish there were, the populations of fish, who ate what, the whole thing. There was a huge amount of data. And if you built a dynamical model, which is one kind of model, you could represent all these averages and population densities and changes very well because it was also measured. Peter's point was that if you ran the model, if you asked the model what was going to happen next, it told you everything died. And his point was that the model was using averages. It was using the most likely behaviours. But actually what happens in practice is, let's say there's a reduction in food supply, then a number of things happen. The first of all is the older fish or the younger fish die first. So you get a shift in the average weight or the average age of the population of a certain fish. They will adapt to eat different things. That those kind of behaviours are not modelable in a simple dynamical systems model because they're emerging behaviours, they're learning behaviours as adaptive to situations changing. So things can become resilient through this kind of micro maneuvering of, well, we'll eat something different, well, actually the population's changed because, the old die first, or the weak die first. So actually we get a more robust population. These are the kind of intricacies that we have to take into account if we're really going to understand resilience. So the final thing to say about other approaches to complexity is that there are also loads of people who are really interested in practice, in the practicalities of this, and it's not that I'm not, but I'm probably not somebody who develops methods in a kind of very structured way. But for example, SenseMaker, David Snowden's work on SenseMaker, which I remember him talking about over 20 years ago, is a masterful example of how to help people work with narrative fragments, work with qualitative change, sense into both patterns and the emergence of newness, work in groups. It's a masterful piece of work, and the work that Irene Gilt did and with colleagues in terms of writing a book about that and really explaining how to use it very fully is absolutely fantastic and a hugely important resource. So some people are really good at that. They will take these ideas and operationalize them, and that's I can only admire them. It's not what interests me. And I will say a little bit more about how I work with these ideas in a minute. But I'm just wondering if that's a good time to pause, Jocko and Barbara, and just see if there are any questions now, or before I kind of say a whole lot of other things about my approach to practice.
Well, we have two questions. I don't know if you guys would like to raise your hands. Ian had a question and Susan Hasty had a question. So Ian, you were up first. Do you want me to read the question? Or would you like to unmute yourself? Okay.
I'm unmuted so I can read it. Yeah. It was actually effectively asked the same question. I just said, could you expand on resonance? You mentioned it and then didn't say much about it. And somebody else clarified it was ontological resonance. But it's the same question. Could you just elaborate on the significance of that?
Yeah. So what I found myself doing in writing the Dao of Complexity, and it was like I did this first and then wrote about it, was I was I'm interested in, Prigogine was talking about chemical systems and came up with this understanding of this micro granular patterning emergence. I started to, over several years, read other things. So I would read about, I read a book by David Eagleman on the brain. There was a very good TV series based on his work. And he's not steeped in complexity thinking, but he starts to describe how the brain emerges over time, through time. There are kind of repeating patterns that come out of our experience, that over time, depending on what happens to us, depending on, what interests us, there will be repeating patterns in the brain. And he talks about these patterns being plastic, meaning that they have quite a lot of stickiness, but yet they can always change, and that they change in through chance or through the intention of doing something else. So when I read that, I think, well, he's saying the same thing. He's describing the emerging of patterns and their plasticity, the sense in which they are both, the paradox is they're both relatively fixed and yet can change. If you read about trauma, you read that they're saying that people get very fixed in locked in very fixed patterns that trigger them, but that nevertheless can be unravelled and moved into something else. If you look at the way people like Lee Smolin writes about galaxies and the whole kind of physics of galaxies, you start to see a very similar kind of narrative, which is about the importance of context, the importance of the particularity of the messiness of the particular clouds, that formed the galaxy. I then started to read a number of political writers. I got very interested in how regimes get locked in and how that changes. It's always been an interest of mine. So you read Václav Havel, The Power of the Powerless, or books. There's a wonderful book by Maria Ressa, who's writing about the Philippines. Eke Temel-Kuren, writing, a Turkish woman, who wrote a book, 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship, that I recommend everybody to read, given the state of the world. But you see the same when people really immerse themselves in their subject. They're not theorizing or picking ideas off a shelf. They're doing what the pragmatists talk about, this kind of experiential, naturalistic learning. They seem to reach the same conclusions about the way the world works as I've done, as Prigogine has done, from this field of complexity. The pragmatists, there's Mary Parker Follett. I wrote about her in some detail. She has a granular. She actually talks about a pupil going to school and how the teachers and her parents kind of co-create this. And sometimes, people talk about things like the coupling of the parental system with the teacher system, with the pupil system. And her point is, well, they're not really coupled. It's always about the individual weaving, So what I'm trying to say by talking about it as ontological resonance, I'm not saying to you, the reader, look, I can prove it. This is definitely the same as this. I'm going, look for yourself. Isn't this interesting? Here's my description of my development of Prigogine and Alan's work. Look at that. Now you compare it. I'm not going, you compare it to Eagleman. You compare it to Mary Parker Follett. There's a resonance. Aren't we onto something, guys? That's how I want to argue it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah,
Ian.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Susan, did that answer your question as well?
I have a follow-up.
Okay.
That, so thank you, and this is wonderful. Thank you, Jane. And I've actually been going down the perception action loop in putting it into a more granular way without having to explain the theory. But what's showing up for me is trying to also connect it to an algorithmic methodology that I'm naively looking at sheaf theory, which talks a lot about coherence. And so the ontological resonance and ontological coherence, one, do you see a significant difference? And do you sense any connection there between how we're perceiving salience versus relevance, if that makes any sense, the first question?
I'm not entirely sure I understand what you're asking.
Okay.
What I'm describing is not algorithmic. It's like the Moran talks about the difference between general complexity and restricted complexity. This is sort of algorithmic approaches are already limiting, what is there. So there's also I could riff a lot about coherence. I write about coherence in the book because it has a particular mathematical reason.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to reconcile. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is, and this is brief, is that the resonance is actually, that's in the meaning making, whereas the algorithmic is more is where the coherence is.
I don't think so. Algorithms don't. Algorithms are a particular simplification of the complex world by some people. The I'm not talking about exactly about meaning making. I'm talking about ontological resonance, meaning if you look at the way the brain works, it seems to work in a very similar way to the way ecologies emerge or the way galaxies emerge. So I'm not telling you they're the same. I'm saying you look for yourself, but there's an ontological similarity. It resonates with me in that. It's not a meaning making. Coherent is used hugely, it's a hugely problematic word, and I'm always ending up in discussions with people where we're talking across each other about the use of the word coherence.
Coherence.
What the complex world isn't. The complex world is incoherent. In my view, it creates patterns that connect incoherently. Coherence to a mathematician means it's a bit like a rubber sheet that if one bit moves, everything moves exactly in the same way. It's absolutely follows in a deterministic fashion. That's what coherence means to me, but it isn't what everybody means by coherence. So okay. I find it a difficult word, but okay. there's something about incoherent. What creates the diversity in the complex world is the ability to connect, but in a way that's not entirely determined, that has incoherent comings together, and then fallings apart. So yeah, some help.
Yeah, no, that's very good. The sheaf theory actually is more about the coupling and uncoupling and gluing, so it leaves room for emergence.
Yes,
if that's what, if specifically the algorithm, when you stop at Bayesian, then you're stuck at a different level. But thank you.
Yes, and I'm sort of not using mathematics. I did theoretical physics, so I allegedly can do sums, but I'm arguing from a kind of observational, experiential point of view, which interestingly so did Prigogine, although he did masses of mathematics, and he and Peter Allen, drove themselves mad trying to solve the master equation and all sorts of things. But there's something about, I invite us all to immerse ourselves in. So what do you really notice? Organizations are a large sort of family. If you look at families, what do you notice about when do they have resilience and when don't they? That's the kind of thing I'm inviting us to look at, I think. But thank you for the question, Susan.
Okay, so David Crow has very, very helpfully said that resonance is ontological vibes, which I'm not quite sure about. Yeah. Chris Matz has patiently had his hand up, so we'll take Chris's question and then you can go on, Jean, and we'll take more questions at the end. Chris.
Hi there, Jean. Fantastic talk. Thank you. It's lovely to see how you're bringing all these different threads in. One name I didn't hear you mention is Carl Weick and sense making, because when I think of patterns, I kind of like you see a pattern and it's lovely, but then the real joy is when you see the same pattern in more than one place, because that might hint that there's some kind of deeper thing going on. And I just wondered about whether, how important you think the work of, say, Carl Weick and sense making and the use of metaphors is in that process of kind of discovery.
Yes. Well, I do talk about Weick in the book, and I've been talking a lot in this talk about ontology as opposed to epistemology, as opposed to kind of how we know. And there is a section in the book on kind of what does this all mean for ways of knowing. So I'm not deeply steeped in Weick, but I have many colleagues who are. They won't, they bring me back to Weick and to process sociology. So there's a section in the book on process sociology, and I, certainly Weick's work is very pertinent in this way to sense making, I can't talk about everything today, but I certainly like Weick, and I like, Robert Scheer and the people who are talking about process sociology. Scheer's work is more focused on organisations. Chris Moles, who works with Ralph Stacey and who I also know very well. He builds a lot on the sociologists as well, and there's a lot of resonance there with what I'm describing. So my starting point is almost like the why question, and then I think Vike brings in some of the how in a very effective way.
Okay, thank you. Barbara, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So I think Jean, if you have some more to say, and then I see a few more questions in the chat, but we'll take those at the very end, okay?
Yeah.
Sound good? All right, good.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. So what I'm trying to describe in this talk, and I haven't said very much about ways of knowing, is to try and ground where I'm coming from and the tradition of complexity that I am steeped in trying to kind of get to grips with the nature of change, the nature of the complex world. And I've mentioned some of the people who've influenced me, and I very much fit with, if there's a lovely paper that I refer to in the book by Morin called The Difference Between Restricted Complexity and General Complexity. And I'm very much standing in this ground of critical thinking in a way. It is, and I haven't said very much so far. Obviously I can do about Daoism. I'll say just a little bit about that. So the first resonance that really got me and came from initially from Peter Allen, coming back to Cranfield one day, clutching the Tao Te Ching, which he'd picked up randomly in a second-hand bookshop in London and read on the train, and was saying, golly, this is amazing. The introduction to this translation, it reads like a complexity theory textbook, and so I read it, and I've reread it and reread it and reread it, and it really does. And I found that completely entrancing. How come in the 5th century BC they were talking about, the end is in the beginning. They were talking about the door is not always open, which I've called episodic change, which I was writing about before. I really got into that. It's a processual view. It's a view of everything always becoming. It's a view of the importance of context that's really embedded in the Tao Te Ching and Susan, the Tao Te Ching, it's kind of intrigued me. And this particular translation of the Tao Te Ching has a very long introduction. The introduction is nearly as long as the book, which really describes the ideas embedded in Daoism. And I highly recommend it. It's something I dip into. And indeed, it was part of the motivation for writing the Dao of Complexity in the way I have, in kind of relatively standalone, reflective, nuanced pieces. I feel sometimes with complexity thinking, people will say to me, "Oh, I've got self-organization," or I understand, emergence," and I'm trying in as well as I can to kind of unpick and find nuance in those ideas, which sometimes have a lot more complexity themselves in them than you might feel when you've kind of got them from reading particular things. So the other thing that the Tao includes, as well as a kind of ontological, sharing the same processual worldview as my view of complexity, or Prigogine's view of complexity, is goes further than that, in that it is talking about value and behaviour, and in a sense, what do we have to do if we want a better world? So the Tao is focusing on how do we cultivate ourselves with the whole in mind, with everyone, with the future, with nature. It's quite a nature-based view. So the Tao Te Ching is going further in kind of educating us. Well, with these ideas in mind, what should we do if we want to be a good leader? With a view of encouraging others to work in a kind of compassionate, relational way that's in service of the future and each other. So you can argue, that complexity theory is value neutral. It tells you how to be bad and win, in a sense, as well as how to try and create a future that's sustainable, resilient, fair. And I find it interesting that diversity, which is one of the having sufficient diversity and connectivity, is what creates resilience, whereas complexity will show you that vast inequality, a real loss of diversity and polarization, becomes much more brittle and less resilient and leads to collapse. And I think the collapse word has to be kind of around these days as well. So that's a little bit about Daoism. But what I just wanted to finish by talking about was so what can I give you an idea of what I do? So this all sounds all well and good. I've also worked, as I've described as a consultant and still do, working with organizations, working with strategy. What do I do when I'm not teaching these ideas? And I work so my starting point, supposing you were asking me to help develop strategy or policy or review your programming approach, I always start with a kind of very broad a diagnostic as I can do. So, for example, I did some work a few years ago, which was in North Kenya, and it was to do with how can we make our programming, more adaptive and resilient to the kind of changing context that we work in. And my starting point would always be broaden in as a big a way as I can, talk to very many people, read about the past, read past reports, talk to people who've left the organisation, talk to other organisations, talk to people who live there. As much as I possibly can, I am trying to collect raw and rich information in a kind of, initially in a quite an unstructured way. So I would invite people, if they were working with me and when they work with me, let's, go and talk to as many different sorts of people as you can. If you're trying to change an organisation, go and talk to the people on the shop floor, go and talk to the people in reception, observe how people operate, talk to customers and suppliers, talk to people who've left, talk to people who've retired. Try and inform yourself in terms of multiple perspectives in as many ways as you can. So there's a lot of data there. There's a lot of kind of richness of information. And then what I would be seeking to do, and I would do this differently if I was doing it more on my own or if I was doing it with a group. So I might, in working with a group, be working with Post-it notes, pictures, narrative fragments. So not dissimilar to, I think, the way that the sense maker and David Snowden might work, but I'd be doing it more, with bits of paper and in a messy way. But I'd be trying to get people to start to see if there's any virtuous circles, vicious circles, opportunities, very strong patterns, what's there. If I'm doing my own interviewing, if I'm wandering vaguely around the territory reading things, I would start to tend to find that hypotheses would arise, or I'd find different people in very different ways would start saying similar things, and then I'd start to test those out. So I'd be starting to converge then into a more coherent view of some of the salient features. So some of the kind of key patterns that are there. Now, to add to that description that I've just done, the thing that I think that complexity thinking brings to that kind of mapping, and lots of you could say, oh, I do that mapping my way. That's fine. I know what you're saying. I've got my map. What I think the complexity lens adds to that is I'm always asking the dynamic question. So I'm asking about, well, where's this come from? What's the past? Where did it start? With the view that often the past is still in the present. Can I interrogate the sort of depth of the patterns that I'm seeing? Where have they come from? Have they been there a long time? And I'm also asking questions about what do you see is coming next? What are you envisaging? Have you noticed anything new happening? What do these trends seem to you to be saying? So it's a kind of mixture of systemic thinking, futures thinking, but looking both for patterns and for shoots, unravelings, cracks, shoots, individuals. Sometimes the important thing is a key person has either left or come, or there's been a key event that's had great waves. So I'm always both looking at patterns and particularities. I'm looking at the dynamic. I'm wanting to ask questions about the past. And I think of everything that I've brought into organisations, the things that people always say to me is the two things that are the most different is I pay more attention to where things have come from, to the kind of the movement. I'm more interested in that rather than, well, let's work out what's here now. And then the other thing that people say is that I pay more attention to the qualitative small nuances. How do we alert ourselves and bring into this picture those things, as well as, well, I've done this map and I know what the big bits are. It's that movement, that paradox between the two. So that's a way I work. And I had a conversation with someone last week who works in food and agricultural policy, and I was really fascinated to hear him describe the way he worked in similar veins. So it's not rocket science. And if I'm working with organisations, I very rarely use the word complexity, systems, or anything. It gets in the way. It informs how I work. So I'm looking for multiple perspectives. I'm looking for the dynamics. I'm looking for the stable and these kind of minute changes. So it affects the questions I ask and how I direct the group. But it in my experience, it doesn't really help if I go, I'm actually a complexity expert and I'm taking you on a complexity journey. We then get into a whole lot of assumptions and difficulties and arguments. So I haven't found it's necessarily very useful in my consultancy work. So that's just a flavour of the kind of way I work, and it's looser. It's a sort of softer, looser way. And sometimes what I would then do, if we were coming up with certain if the group was starting to kind of home in on certain things, well, it looks like we should do this, or this looks a really promising avenue, then we would look quantitatively at some of that. There may be some factual things. Well, actually, is there a market there? How big has it been? What are the competition doing? So it's at that stage, then I might then be suggesting that we actually, and we can bring in hard data as well as soft data in the earlier parts, but there's a sort of apprehension stage, which is both qualitative and quantitative, big and broad, that then moves into a kind of clustering, thematic, but with this idea of the dynamic. Let me give you just one example of where that can be important. I was doing some work for an INGO a few years ago, and it was about fragility, and what the Fragile States Index had Syria. This is quite a long time ago, in just before Syria blew up in 2012, as not a fragile state. It was 42nd on a Fragile States Index. The reason being is that the measures of fragility or stability were static. So the Fragile States Index asks, are there roads? Are there universities? Is there conflict? What's the economic outlook? And all those things it passed. If you'd have looked at it dynamically and systemically, you'd have started to be more. It would have been more obvious that there'd been a drought in that had affected the farming in southeast Syria. There was no social safety net anymore, because although Assad the elder had been a dictator, he had created a social safety net. He supported people if there was difficulties, but with a free market ideology adopted by Assad the younger, there was no longer any safety net. So at the same time as all that, the oil that they had was starting to diminish. So you have important resource that's diminishing. You have drought. You have no social safety net, and you have people starting to move towards Damascus and the cities, who have nowhere else to go. So that was the trigger for a real at the same time as the Arab Spring happening all over the place. So you've got young people going, we don't want this anymore. We want a new world. So you can see that dynamically and systemically that adds up to a vicious circle, where many things are coming together and creating fragility that wasn't rocket science, but wasn't going to come out of a static fragile states index. So that's an example of where working dynamically gives you a different perspective on what's going on. So the final thing I just wanted to say a little bit about was this issue of why is it so difficult sometimes to kind of talk complexity with organizations, or why do some people want to manage complexity or simplify complexity or reduce complexity, and other people see it as a kind of vibrant resource of potential? Why do we have all these differences around it? And it's there's many ways to consider this, and this is kind of me working out how to say some of this. But we live in an organizational world that prefaces a mechanical worldview. It wants certainty, it wants measurement, and it can sometimes feel that organizations would rather live with, controlling and measuring things rather than doing them better. I had a conversation last week with somebody who's become head of resources for one of the big councils near here. And he was saying, I've taken over this department. The only thing anybody will talk about is austerity and shaving budgets. And because the IT system is siloed, there doesn't seem to be any way or any appetite for actually re-engineering, thinking, can we do things differently? Can we join things up? Can we go back to what's our core purpose, and how do these different services that we give, can they be reframed or rethought about? All we're doing is shaving the bits off and reducing, trying to live with this kind of austerity model. So that we don't encourage anybody in many organizations. We don't encourage them to reach for their imagination, or reach towards what they might more naturally do in other parts of their world, where they're trying to solve problems. They're imbued with their own value system. They're considering, if they're working with their families, they're trying things out. They're changing, the ways the family worked in order to help their children or help their partners, move forward and have a happy life. But we're encouraged to leave all that aspect of ourselves at the door and go into organizations and behave like machines and, play up and play our part in the cog. So we're limiting consciousness. We're downplaying a kind of opportunity to develop and extend and get confident with handling ambiguity, considering our values, dealing with multiple perspectives. We're neither encouraging people to do that, nor are we giving them opportunities to kind of strengthen their muscles into this kind of expanding, more sophisticated form of consciousness that we have access to in us. We all have access to that, but we're not able to play with it, or we're not rewarded for saying, excuse me, I don't think that would work, or here's a better way, or I've noticed this in this organization or in this part of the organization, or there's something new happening in the market. It's like we tell people, switch all that off, just fill in the form, just stick to the knitting, do what you're doing. And, to end on just one example of that, I have some colleagues who work in health, there's been a case in the UK recently, last year, where a nurse has seemingly been killing babies, and it was seemingly. I'm telling this as a story. I'm not saying this is factual necessarily. I'm not in a position to know, but people tried to say there's something funny going on in this department, and they were regarded as misogynistic. They weren't trusted. So this went on for a long time. And what my colleague was saying in a meeting about complexity, and was kind of tearing her hair about this, she was saying, what's going to happen is we're going to tighten up the machine. We're going to have more rules and regulations, more checks, more forms to fill in, more inspections. What we need to do is to engender teamwork in like they used to be much more in hospitals, where people observe each other, look after each other, coach each other, trust each other. It then becomes much harder to have rogue behavior if people know each other and see each other and work collectively in a situation, rather than have an efficiency model, which means that every single shift has got different combinations of people on it. Very much harder to build trust. And also, it's the sort of trust that allows people to say, I'm a bit unhappy about that. Can you tell me again why you did that? So that it isn't a sort of bland, participatory, beige sort of trust. It's actually trusting enough to be able to challenge, to have different views, to dig around. So that what she was saying is we need a much more naturalistic, back to my word, approach to governance, which yes, has some form filling in and some regulations and some rules, but engenders governance through an embodied, trusting, collective view of what's going on. But what we won't do, she said, we won't do that. We'll go back to this kind of machine perspective. So this sense of consciousness, that if you're working in a team, you're starting to trust yourself, you're starting to try things out, you take responsibility, you alert somebody to a problem. If you're just asking people to stick to the rules, you're not going to have an organization that can learn and adapt and grow, and the consciousness of individuals can learn and adapt and grow. And I think it makes it much harder then. What all people want when you talk about complexity is to say, well, how do you measure it? Or what use is that to me? Because they're so steeped in that their reward system comes in a sense about playing the game of the machine to some degree, whether it works or not. So that's something I've been thinking about as well. So I think I'd like to leave it there and just, yes, I hope that's been interesting, and see if there are any more questions.
I mean, it was great, Jean. There's lots of stuff going on in the chat. I know Jocko has a question that he would like to ask you, and then I will try to make up some sort of queue of the rest of the questions and statements. Jocko.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Before we jump into all the questions that are in the chat, which are great and very deep, I'm curious, is the Tao Te Ching, when it was written in kind of a chaotic period of Chinese history, was not the easiest book to interpret at the time that it was written, let alone being translated several hundred years later into cultures that are very, very different. So with that, I'm curious of what translations are you fond, translation or translations are your favorite, and why?
Well, the Ames and Hall are two Chinese scholars that have written innumerable books on Chinese philosophy, not just the Tao Te Ching. I'm pointing over there. I've got about 6 of their books. They make a very good point, which I talk about in the Dao of Complexity, that you have to be very careful about the dictionary that you use to understand Daoism. That the original people who were developing a Chinese European, I'll say English, but Chinese European dictionary were the missionaries. And they weren't interested in translating the Tao Te Ching. They were interested in translating the Bible into Chinese. And so they were looking for words that meant God and heaven and these kind of transcending ideas and creation. So they found the word that was nearest to those and said, oh, that's what, that's Qian means heaven. And even Dao means the way, and what Ames and Hall are saying is you have to be very careful about those translations, because they then kind of reinterpret the Tao Te Ching with ideas like heaven and beginnings in them. Whereas if you look at the Chinese dictionaries, you'll find that many of these words, first of all, Chinese doesn't make a difference between verbs and nouns. So although many people talk about the way as a thing to follow, what they feel that was being said is it's way making. It's a verb. It's like the way is made through walking. It's an active process. It isn't like there is a way and you follow it. It is you're co-creating the way as you go. And that many of the words have multiple meanings. And what Ames and Hall were saying is confusing for us Westerners. Is that doesn't mean you can choose the meaning that most suits your purpose. It actually means they're all true at the same time. So I've been very sold on this argument. I like the way they translate it. It isn't the most beautiful, and I've got 6 or 7 translations of the Tao Te Ching, but there's certain phrases that are very pertinent to the ontological understanding of it. And I've played around. I think I took it out of the book in the end, but I had 6 translations of the same stanza, and they, it's very easy to just read it through a Western lens and look for transcendental ideas. And they didn't have them. They were really much more interested in, so when they talk about beginnings, they mean it's a bit like Prigogine, always becoming. They mean things are always beginning. There's a continuous beginningness happening. There's a continuous flow, and yet things get stuck. And I think it's written in paradoxical and complex language, that it's not supposed to be understood in that way. It's like a koan, it has a kind of quality that you go, oh, what does that mean? And it sort of seeps into you over time. It's something that becomes imbued with meaning in a different sort of way. So that's my answer to that. I do think, you have to be careful of the translations, and there's a lot written about it that is quite Western, like following the way, which sounds very Christian. It's easy for us to want it to sound like something we're familiar with in the way we've been brought up, but it isn't. It's more Buddhist. It has more in common with Buddhism, and indeed Chan Buddhism was a marriage between Buddhism from India and Chinese and Daoism.
Yeah. I don't want to put you on the hook, but is there 2 or 3 translations that might be better to go to from a complexity angles rather than other ones? Because there's literally hundreds of them in English alone.
Yeah, Ames and Hall.
That's the one. Okay.
And it's not just read the Tao Te Ching, read the introduction. It really describes, a processual worldview, what it means to talk about the particularity of the situation. It's quite, and there's bits you can find. Certainly, I can't remember which one it is now, whether it's Roger Ames or David Hall. But there's a link in the book to a YouTube clip. I can find that, which is very accessible. In my view, and people, not everybody will agree, but go to Ames and Hall. And 2003 Tao Te Ching. I can find it in a minute and wave it at you, or we can put it in the chat later.
It's in the chat, yeah. And thank you very much, Steve. I think it was Steve that put it in the chat. Thank you. Okay. Gianni. Okay. Sandra, you had a question from before, so I was wondering if you'd like to pose it to Jean now.
Okay, thank you. And this whole nuanced exposition of your ideas is really so helpful. Really appreciate it. So to tell you a little bit about myself, I come from an academic tradition, and I've moved into consulting and coaching, but oddly, the 2 foundations for me is human development and complexity science. And there are many that work in complexity science so it's really, I'm struggling with how to meld the micro with the large framework. And from my own experience, I've observed that the way an individual or a group of individuals, their patterns of communicating, which I would say relates to their capacity to deal with ambiguity, their capacity to respect multiple perspectives. This is my perspective, influences this capacity for shift within a team or a larger and it relates to their development. And I'm not saying they're gooder or anything, but there does seem to be a relationship. So I'm wondering what your perspective is. And it really, I'm looking to the micro, moving to the macro. How do they interrelate? And what is your perspective on how an individual or a group's human development influences what's unfolding?
Yeah, well, great question. And I can see Steve on my screen here. Steve and I had a coffee this morning having this conversation, didn't we, in downtown, in the town where I live. It's a tricky one. There are many developmental frameworks of kind of people's increasing ability to deal with complexity, both cognitively and emotionally. So we were talking this morning about 3 or 4 different frameworks that kind of suggest that, a bit like Maslow's hierarchy, you start in a particular way. As a child, I used to, keep records of my money, and things like that. It was a security base. And then it kind of, you become more attuned to dealing with kind of ambiguity, complexity, paradox, and over time. And it tends to be both a weaving of the cognitive with the emotional. So one of the frameworks I've seen talks about complexity thinking, and I think that's a mistake. I think it's not just thinking. It's a whole thing. It's an embodiment of something, and I think it seems to be the case that some people are more comfortable with that from the start than others. And it reminds me of Jung's work on differentiating between people who are more sensing based, more factually based, and more intuitive. So for example, if you show people a photograph or a picture, some people will be inclined to say that's a picture of 4 trees. It's got 3 people in it and 2 boats. And the intuitive people will go, that reminds me of my holiday last year, and it looks lovely, and the sun's shining, and they'll be more descriptive. So we tend to have preferences that are different, and some of these preferences develop over time. So what I was slightly trying to say earlier is I think that we tamp down in organizations such that people's ability to develop into that more into the capacity to handle ambiguity, to see paradox, to feel rewarded for taking risks or having critical thinking or seeing what's wrong with something or noticing something new is tamped down. So we don't create conditions as leaders. We're just telling people to do what they're told and measure it. So that's one thing. And some of what I try to do in which are just simple ways of doing it is I will use kind of techniques, lots of questions, things like, have you been involved in strategy? Has it gone to plan? Why hasn't it gone to plan? And then that's a concrete question. And then they can answer the question of why their strategy hasn't gone to plan, which will, in a sense, demonstrate the complex world. Well, things change. There was new competition. The market wasn't what we expected. We didn't really understand what we were doing. We were let down by this department. They will describe the emerging complexity in the reason why their strategy didn't go to plan. Then I might say, well, I've talked a bit about the theory of complexity. With that in mind, what could you do differently? To make your strategy more effective. And then they'll start saying things like, well, I could review it more often. We could build stronger relationships with the departments that have been, letting us down. We could take the time for one of us to go into the market more often, or, manage by wandering about. So they can then often invent micro practices, that don't take too long. Or we can visit the shop. We can visit the salespeople once a week and say, "Do you notice anything new in the market?" So that makes it nice and concrete. You're not kind of making them let go of their certainty and what they're rewarded for in the organization, but you are sort of flexing it a bit into, well, we'll review more often, we'll have more contingency, we'll try 2 experiments, not just 1. So that's one way I approach it, to try and ease people into that. Another approach I use sometimes is to kind of use the example of the family. And I say, I'm a social worker and I'm coming to visit your family because you're a bad family. And I'm going to decide whether you're in one of 4 categories. Are you a this family or that family, or A, B, C or D family? And when I've categorized you in my 2-day, in my 2-hour visit, then I have the right plan for you. And then, you can go off and that'll make you better. And then we can come and measure it. What would you say if I said that? And of course, everybody goes, oh, no, not my family, because my family is unique and we have this history, So the point being, but we do that to schools, certainly in the UK, the way we assess schools is exactly like that. Somebody rocks along for a couple of days, and then tells you whether you're outstanding, good, bad, or, underachieving. And, if you're lucky, they saw the right things or they came on the right day. If you're not lucky, they didn't. But you'd never do that to your family. You'd argue with me. And then I can just say, well, isn't an organization just a bigger version of a family? That's just a small, complex, open, adaptive system. But, what about your family? And then it becomes easier to say, well, okay, if we were able to flex a bit from these very rigid ways that we do things, what would make a bit of difference? What would you, can we use pictures and postcards and narrative fragments and more sculpting? Can we sculpt this organization and see it slightly differently? So those are the kind of things, and I'm sure you would do the same. You don't have to be a complexity person to say that, but it's kind of nudging and easing people into that. And I think also as leaders, we have a responsibility, even if we're stuck in some kind of rigid, I'm being made to work in this way. You can ask people at the end of a meeting, like every meeting, anything new and interesting going on, anything you'd like to mention, anything that surprised you, any new ideas you've had. Take 5 minutes at the end of every meeting and you start to kind of develop a slightly different culture that allows people to even imagine they're allowed to think those thoughts. So they're not rocket science answers, but I do think you're right. And I find in teaching complexity over 25, 30 years, I've got used to the fact that 10% of the people in the room will come and look at me starry-eyed, wring my hands and say, you've saved my life. I've always thought like this. And you've now said something that makes sense of the world. I've always thought this. Thank you so much. And 10% of the people will walk out and say, well, this is not practical. I don't want to hear this. I just want to make money and win, and I'm not going to win by listening to all this, confusing, messy stuff. So it is true that, not everybody easily gets this. But finding those questions or examples, or, I use examples. I talk about the Finnish education system in the UK, which is much more holistic and emerging. So it's always coming up with some questions or some examples that just rock people's, security sometimes. And I think just sort of a very long answer to your question. Thank you for being patient. The final thing I'd say is I often find in working in other countries, in working with people in Africa, who haven't been quite so contaminated by Western values and education, they much more naturally see this. I always felt my mum, who left school very young, she used to think this, what I said was so obvious. She couldn't understand why anybody paid me anything or thought it was good. We have actually educated people out of this in the way that we run organisations. And I always sigh when the first question, an organisation asks me is how I'm going to measure the success of my contribution, as opposed to, it's not a bad question, but I'd like it if they asked me how was I going to do it, rather than, feel that was the killer question. So I hope, does that help at all? Does that make any sense?
Yeah. And if I might, I have one follow-up question for those 10% that are seeing the broader possibilities, right? And have you found a way to leverage them to really influence others, or to to encourage the learning, or the shifting to more constructive pathways?
Yes, I think that what I find is when people start to get it, it's often because they knew it anyway. This was the world they inhabited, but they felt they had it beaten out of them. They weren't valued for their ability to see the big picture, or move from the small to the big. So often they will contact me. It's about what they read. It's about joining networks of people who think like them. I noticed, for example, on LinkedIn that there's some absolutely fabulous stuff written, not by complexity thinkers or systems thinkers, but just people like you who are working with the complexity and ambiguity and nuance that we need people to get in their day-to-day work and in their leadership, that can really be supported by reading about how people do this. So I think it's a question of people being supported. I don't particularly think people have got to get the theory. I think what the theory for me does, my Prigogine Allen way into the theory, is it's a way of saying, dear world, science said this. You've got, this book is really saying you've used the wrong science to manage the social and natural world. This is a better science. It's scientific. So you can't tell me, tell us that we're talking woolly nonsense, because it's science. It's the science of open systems and da. So it has a narrative with power because it comes from science. But many people, like these political writers I've talking about, they don't need all this. They get it through their experiential work, I think. So
thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the question.
Lovely. I think Ian has left, but before he went, he started a ruckus in the chat about the idea of diversity and requisite variety. So, Jean, if you would just briefly, is it the same? Is it different? I'd like to hear your take on that.
Yes. And then I've realized I'm going to have to go because I'm actually going to the theatre in 12 minutes.
12 minutes, okay.
The performance starts at 7 p.m, so I'm going to have to leg it up the road in a minute. Ashby talked about requisite variety. And in the first book that we wrote, Peter Allen talks about the law of excess diversity. So in other words, requisite variety says you've got just enough variety to kind of adapt if nothing else happens. But for emergence and newness to happen, you've got to have more than that. So you need more than the requisite. In the view of if you're looking for emergence and the ability of things to actually invade, change, reframe, create new aspects to state space. One of the questions I can't answer is, well, what's too much diversity and what's enough diversity? And I don't know. It depends on the situation, and you'll have to show up and find out. If everybody's arguing with everybody, it's what you call chaos. It requires enough ability to handle difference that there's some challenge, but not too much. Jocko was talking about who was talking about Goldilocks to me today. Somebody was talking about Goldilocks. It's a Goldilocks zone. It's enough, but not too much. And it depends on the situation. And you have to find that out by being there. But it's as we know, diversity sounds great, but it's actually very difficult. I remember working with a group in a bank who, on a particular personality test, all but 2 of the people there had exactly the same profile in this particular model, and they all violently agreed with each other. And there were 2 different people who kept saying, but could it be this? And they were going, no, don't be stupid. That's stupid. It's this. And I was in the invidious position of A, being more like the 2 rather than the mass, and trying to uphold their view and get these guys to actually see that there was another way. And that's one example of where diversity is needed and hard to imagine, because we want people to be like us and perhaps have a bit more. But I worked with, I saw him last weekend, actually, a very close colleague for many, many years, who was absolutely brilliant with people. Everything had to stop if there was a need to actually, coach somebody or deal with what somebody was going through. And I was always, when I worked with him, tearing my hair out, because I always wanted to move on to the next thing, and I wanted to get somewhere, and I had my material I wanted to cover. And it was an incredibly both good and frustrating partnership, because his difference, to me, that was more in the moment with people, more relational in that sense, just drove me completely insane. But they loved it, and I had to be patient, and we had to kind of cajole each other. And ever so often he'd slow me down, and ever so often I'd speed him up. And it actually worked very well. But embracing diversity isn't easy. And I think the answer to how much is enough and not too much is well, try it out and see. It's keep asking the question. Anyway.
Lovely.
Yes.
Gianni?
All right. So you want to do a wrap up? Do you want to stop the recording first?
No, just say Jean, thank you so much. You're always welcome.
Thank you very much.
We've enjoyed this immensely, and we hope you will come back soon. And the book is wonderful. Everybody, I don't have the cover here with me, but everybody, I strongly recommend that you grab a copy of the Dao of Complexity. So thanks a lot. We'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
Enjoy the theater.
I will. Right. Bye then.
Bye-bye.